Ask yourself a question. If you had the ability to travel to some time and place in the past, where would you go, and what would you want to see? There are those who might choose to go back and learn what really happened the day President Kennedy was shot, or who might try to stop the Titanic from hitting an iceberg, saving 1,500 lives. Some people might choose to meet an ancestor or use the information they have now to get rich. We don't have the ability to go back in time, yet, but we can do the next best thing and combine our imagination with what we know about history and archaeology. In this video, we are going to go back to ancient Rome. But first, if you love history like I do, please subscribe to help this channel grow. As a bonus, you'll be the first to know when new videos are added. Also, let us know in the comments what time and place in the past you'd visit if you had a time machine. Ancient Rome, from the end of the Second Punic War in 201 BC until the death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180, was probably the best place in the world to live. During that era, it was a prosperous and powerful civilization, experiencing a golden age. But it wasn't all flowers and sunshine. In fact, for a lot of Romans, life could be very harsh. The factor that determined how well and how long you lived, more than anything else, not just in ancient Rome, but in most times and places throughout history, was money. So it is probably best to start our journey by looking at Roman money. There were no banks, and paper money would not be invented for more than 1,300 years. So if you had money in ancient Rome, you had it in the form of coins. The Roman system of coinage was much more advanced than what came later in the Middle Ages, and even in the Renaissance. They used coins made of gold, silver, and bronze, and you would need some if you hoped to survive in ancient Rome. The highest valued Roman coin was the gold Arius. Common people would have seldom seen, much less had in their possession, these valuable coins, which were the equivalent of about a month's pay for a laborer of modest skill. The Arius would have been a coin used primarily by the government and people of high social standing. The Roman gold Arius was more than just a means of exchange. It was also a symbol of power and prestige of the Roman Empire. Because the Arius was an extremely valuable coin, it was often used in large transactions such as payments to soldiers and government officials. It was also used to pay tributes and to fund the construction of public works such as roads, aqueducts, and buildings. The Arius was also used as a form of propaganda by the emperors. The images and inscriptions on these coins were carefully selected to convey a message of power, legitimacy, and authority. Emperors would often use their portraits on the coins to reinforce their images of powerful and successful ruler. And the depictions on the reverse would often celebrate their achievements, such as military victories or the construction of public works. A much more common coin, in fact the standard denomination of Roman currency during the 400-year period that we are looking at, was the denarius. The denarius was a silver coin with a weight of about 3.9 grams that was worth 1/25 of an Arius. That means that a denarius was commonly considered a day's wage for a common worker. It was a lot of money, but not so much money that it was impractical. The denarius was such a common part of daily life that it's even mentioned in various passages in the Bible, like Matthew 22, where Jesus tells a parable of workers being paid a denarius for a day's work in the vineyards. The denarius was minted in almost pure silver until the Emperor Nero began a policy of currency debasement that would last for the rest of Roman history. But that will be the subject of a future video. Suffice it to say that if you made a denarius a day, you could just scratch out a meager living, providing your family with a room to live in that they might share with another family, and just enough food to keep you, your wife, and a couple of kids alive, and humble clothing that you would patch rather than replace when it became worn. The next commonly used coin denomination is the sestertius, a favorite among coin collectors because it is a large and heavy bronze coin that was worth 1/4 of a denarius. The next step down the coinage ladder was the dupondius, which was worth 1/8 of a denarius. The dupondius was a medium-sized bronze coin, not as large as the sestertius, but still impressive. The next commonly encountered Roman coin is the bronze ass, a coin that is about as big as the dupondius, but usually slightly lighter. Although the ass is about the same size as the dupondius, it is only worth half as much, 1/16 of a denarius. You can usually distinguish the ass from the dupondius by the type of headwear the emperor is depicted wearing. On the ass, he is usually shown wearing a laurel wreath or bareheaded, while on the dupondius, he is usually shown wearing a radiate crown. The smallest commonly encountered Roman coin is the quadrans. This tiny bronze coin is truly small change, both in terms of its diminutive size and its meager buying power. It was only worth 1/64 of a denarius. Of course, there were other denominations in use at various times in Roman history, and some of the provinces of the empire had their own separate coinage systems that sometimes were used in place of the standard imperial system and sometimes alongside it. But we will just deal with the money used in the capital. Most of the menial jobs in ancient Rome were performed by slaves. We will talk about their lives shortly, but first let's consider gainful employment. If you lived in the Roman countryside, you would have most likely been engaged in some form of agriculture. Most rural Romans raised livestock, grew crops, or in some cases produced wine or bread for the cities and towns. Among the most popular crops were grains used for making bread, various beans, lentils, and peas. Olives were used for making oil, and grapes were also popular crops. Farms could range in size from a few acres worked by a single family to thousands of acres that employed an army of slaves. Pigs were the most common meat source, while cows were raised for milk and goats and sheep provided cheese. Oxen and mules did work that required muscle. Generally, life for a free person on a farm was preferable to life in the city. If you were poor and wanted to rise in class, a great option would be to join the army. The Roman army was huge. In the first century, the Roman army numbered over 125,000 troops, divided into 28 legions, which were stationed all over the empire and were highly mobile. By the time Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180, there were 33 legions and 180,000 troops. If you signed up for the Roman army, you agreed to serve for a term of 20 years and would be a reservist for an additional 5 years after your initial term expired. Upon signing up, you would receive 3 gold arii. You would be paid a wage of a denarius a day, and upon retirement, you could expect to receive several acres of land. Army life also brought a lot of perks while you were actively serving. You had free food, free medical care, and free use of the baths. You would be issued armor and a short sword called a gladius. But army life also had a dark side. Discipline was harsh, often brutal. For minor infractions, you would be beaten, and for more serious offenses, you might be executed. One particularly harsh punishment was called decimation, in which the unit would be divided into groups of 10 soldiers. Each group would draw lots, and whoever drew the short lot was beaten to death by his 9 friends. Most of your time in the Roman army was spent marching, sometimes 15 miles per day. At the end of the day, you would build a fort before you could rest. Each fort was laid out exactly the same as every other fort. Building the fort required excavating, felling timber for the ramparts, and setting up tents. It was work that was both backbreaking and mind-numbingly boring. Most of a Roman soldier's time was spent doing boring jobs, and because of this, a lot of soldiers became addicted to gambling. When excitement did come, it was often in the form of pure terror. Battle in ancient times was up close and personal. You either killed or died looking into the eyes of your opponent. It is recorded that ancient soldiers who were lined up for battle, looking at their enemy a few hundred feet away, would tremble with fear and lose control of their bladder and bowels as they waited for the order to attack. Another common profession was that of merchant. A merchant might import agricultural goods from the countryside, or exotic products from a distant province, or even some land outside the borders of the empire. Olive oil, fabrics and dyes, wine, and even slaves were common import goods. The movement of goods helped keep the Roman economy diverse and prosperous. If you lived in a town or city, you might work as a craftsman who fashioned clay bowls and pots, worked metal, or served as a blacksmith. If you belonged to the higher classes of society, you might become a lawyer or enter politics. But the opportunities in these fields were limited and usually reserved only for the well-to-do. Now that you know what kind of money you would have spent and how you might earn money as a Roman citizen, let's look at what you might have spent that money on, starting with where you would live. If you were well off, you might have an apartment home in the city and a large villa in the country. These elite classes would live in single-family homes called a domus. Most of these houses were laid out with a central atrium, often with a small pool over an open section of roof to collect rainwater. The atrium was surrounded by bedrooms, a kitchen, dining rooms, and storage rooms. An enclosed garden was then found at the back of the domus. These houses were quite comfortable, even by modern standards. In the city, the elite people of Rome tended to build their homes on high ground, the tops of hills, which received more breeze during the hot summer months. This may be where our terms upper class and high class come from. Then as now, the poor were not so fortunate. In the city of Rome, the middle class and working poor would usually live in large apartment buildings called insulae, which literally means island. These apartments were often several stories high. It is estimated that there were over 60,000 of these insulae in the city of Rome during the imperial period. Augustus made a law that no insulae could be more than 7 stories high, which indicates that at least some were taller than that. The apartments in these buildings were often just 1 or 2 small rooms. If you were really poor, you might share your tiny apartment with another family to help stretch your income just a little further. These buildings were dangerous, to say the least. They were prone to fires, they smelled bad, and were a breeding ground for disease due to their poor sanitation. And they sometimes collapsed. Those who lived on the higher floors not only had many dark steps to climb, but they were in greater danger in the all-too-common event of fire. Because of this, those with more money lived on the lower floors. In the Great Fire of AD 64, thousands of people died. Although we do not know for sure, it is a safe assumption that many of those who died were residents of the upper floors of insula. Roman culture was divided into several distinct classes. At the top of the class structure were the patricians. These were wealthy people from old families who made up the ruling class of Roman society. The patrician class was expected to flaunt their wealth, and being wealthy brought respect. To be a member of the Roman Senate, you had to have a certain amount of money. If you fell on hard times and slipped below the minimum net worth, you were unceremoniously kicked out of the Senate. If you were free, but not numbered among the patrician class, you were a plebeian, or pleb for short. The plebeians made up the majority of the Roman population. They were the farmers, the soldiers, and the merchants, along with the working class. At various times in Roman history, the plebs rose up and demanded more rights and a greater say in Roman government. At the bottom of Roman society were the slaves. A large minority of the Roman population were slaves. Some historians estimate that a minimum of 1 in 6 people living in the Roman Empire were slaves. In fact, at one time the Senate proposed making slaves wear a special uniform or badge to make them stand out from free citizens. This idea was abandoned, however, because it was feared the slaves would revolt if they could see how numerous they were. There was a lot of variation in how people became slaves. Unlike modern slavery, in Roman times race did not determine who was eligible to be a slave. If you were unlucky enough to be born a slave, you were automatically a slave yourself. Prisoners of war and foreign captives were also common sources for slaves. Those who fell into debt could be sold as slaves until it was deemed they had worked their debt off, and sometimes poor people would sell themselves into slavery as a means of survival. Your quality of life as a slave depended greatly on who your master was. Some masters were kind, while others were brutal. As a slave, there were no laws to protect you. Your master had the right to beat you, chain you, brand you, or even hang or crucify you. There is the story of one master who had his slaves' legs broken as punishment. Slaves did all of the menial, dangerous, and dirty jobs in Roman society. Many slaves worked in agriculture. Large farms might employ thousands of slaves. Others worked as domestic servants. If you were especially unskilled or unlucky, you might be a low-cost slave purchased to work in a mine or mill, and you would literally be worked until you fell over dead, only to be replaced by another slave who would suffer the same cruel fate. Skilled and educated slaves could lead better lives, working as accountants, supervising their masters' businesses, or teaching upper-class youth. Some slaves were able to save enough money to buy their own freedom, or were favored enough by their master that he would free them. These slaves were designated freedmen, and didn't receive full Roman citizenship. They couldn't vote or hold public office, but their children could become full citizens. Some slaves might be trained in special gladiator schools, where they would be taught to fight in the arena for public entertainment. The games, as they were called, were a popular source of entertainment for the population. During the late Republic, Roman patricians would host the games to show off their wealth and gain favor and votes from the people. In imperial times, the emperor took over hosting the games, which were used to curry favor as well as to distract people, which he hoped would keep them from thinking about rebellion. Wild and exotic animals were imported from all over the empire and were used to kill and be killed in the arena. In the AD 70s, the Flavian emperors Vespasian and Titus built the Colosseum, a vast amphitheater that held 40,000 spectators. When Titus celebrated the opening of the Colosseum in AD 80, he had 9,000 animals of all forms: lions, tigers, elephants, rhinos, bears, and ostriches slaughtered for the amusement of the crowds. In addition to the games, chariot racing was also a popular pastime. The Circus Maximus, where chariot races were put on, held 240,000 spectators. There were 4 teams who competed. These were divided by color into blue, green, white, and red. The Romans were often as passionate for their favorite team as the most dedicated American NFL fanatic or European soccer hooligan. At midday in the arena, criminals would be executed. The Romans were especially imaginative in their methods of executing criminals. They would sometimes reenact a scene from ancient mythology. There are descriptions of criminals being dressed in wings as Icarus and hurtled to their death on a catapult. In other cases, the tale of Prometheus, who gave man fire, was reenacted by having a criminal's stomach torn open by specially trained birds. Other criminals were fed to wild beasts for public entertainment. Crime was rampant in ancient Rome. Being outdoors was unsafe at night as gangs roamed the streets. There is no way to accurately assess the crime rate in Rome, but it was astronomically high by modern standards. Some educated guesses as to the murder rate in the city of Rome during imperial times suggest it may have been over 100 murders per 100,000. For contrast, the murder rate in the United States is 6.5 per 100,000. In Great Britain, it is 1.1 per 100,000. The modern nation with the highest murder rate is Jamaica, with 44.7 murders per 100,000. So we can see just how unsafe Rome was. Perhaps the most dreaded form of capital punishment in the Roman Empire was crucifixion. We are all familiar with what this looked like due to depictions of the crucifixion of Jesus during the reign of Tiberius. However, this manner of execution was not at all uncommon. After a slave revolt in 71 BC, 6,000 people were crucified. Their crosses lined the Appian Way on both sides for miles. In a crucifixion, the condemned would have to push up with his feet, which were often nailed to the cross, in order to gasp for a breath of air. As time passed, his muscles would cramp and he would grow weak, allowing him less air in each gasp. Eventually he would suffocate to death, but this could take days. Crucifixion was also a humiliating form of punishment, as the condemned person was attached to the cross naked after having been severely beaten, and the cross was usually erected in a highly public area, like near a market or a busy road. Unlike we see in a lot of art, the person on the cross was usually only a few inches above ground level, placing him almost eye to eye with passers-by who would have been his neighbors, friends, and people he knew. The least safe profession in all of ancient Rome was that of emperor. 62% of emperors died a violent death. A few died in battle or took their own lives, but most were assassinated. Emperors were often the targets of political rivals, disgruntled members of the military, or ambitious individuals seeking power for themselves. Some of the most famous assassinations include the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, which was carried out by a group of senators who feared his growing power. The assassination of Caligula in AD 41, who was killed by members of the Praetorian Guard who were angered by his erratic behavior, and the assassination of Commodus in AD 192, who was killed by his own advisors who were fed up with his excesses and misrule. Other emperors who were assassinated include Domitian, Pertinax, Maximinus Thrax, Elagabalus, and Severus Alexander. The assassination of emperors was a reflection of the often violent and tumultuous nature of Roman politics and the constant struggle for power and control within the empire. Violent deaths may have been common, but at least the ancient Romans tried to mitigate disease. They understood that hygiene was important to health. Because of this, they built large public baths, had public restrooms with running water, and they brought large quantities of fresh water into the city by means of their system of aqueducts. In spite of this, infant mortality was high, and life expectancy shorter than what we now enjoy. Between a quarter and half of newborns didn't live to see their first birthday. However, if you lived to adulthood and were not a slave, you could expect to live into your 60s, or perhaps beyond. The Emperor Augustus lived to be 75, and his successor Tiberius made it to 77. Childbirth was almost as dangerous to the mother as it was to the infant, with complications for both often resulting in early death. Another common cause of death was the plague, an outbreak that lasted a decade and a half, from AD 165 to 180, killed about 15% of the population, including the emperor himself, Marcus Aurelius. Because the cause and remedy for disease was not well understood, people desperate for a cure often resorted to unorthodox treatments. Because there was no standardized medical education, your quality of treatment depended entirely on your doctor, if you could afford one. The Romans adopted Greek myths and beliefs. Like the Greeks, the Romans were polytheistic and worshipped a pantheon of different gods and goddesses. The principal god, Jupiter, was adopted from the Greek Zeus. Jupiter ruled over the other, lesser gods, all of whom exhibited the same or sometimes worse failings than humans. Animal sacrifices were made to various gods to curry favor or atone for misdeeds. Once the empire was established, citizens were expected to sacrifice to the emperor. Failure to do so was seen as an act of treason. Most households would incorporate a shrine to that family's patron god, as well as a shrine to the emperor. The Romans were generally tolerant of foreign religions, as long as the Roman religion was respected and sacrifices to the emperor were made. This caused a few religions, most notably the Christians, to run afoul of Roman authorities because of their refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods or the emperor. The Christians were looked at suspiciously by the Romans, who accused them of engaging in lewd acts and committing crimes. The Romans lashed out harshly in 10 persecutions that ranged from that of Nero, in which Saints Peter and Paul were killed, to the persecution of Diocletian and Galerius in the early 4th century. Most of these persecutions were of short duration and often local in scope. In spite of this, estimates are that anywhere from 40,000 to 1 million Christians were killed during the Roman persecutions. If a baby survived childbirth, it had to be accepted by the head of the house before officially becoming part of the family. If he failed to accept the baby, it would be exposed, many times in a set location near town, where it was left to die. Often, though, these areas were patrolled by slavers, who would take the child and raise it until it could be sold as a slave. In later times, Christians would often look for these children, adopt them, and raise them as their own. If, however, the child was accepted by the father, it was named at a ceremony that took place 8 or 9 days after birth. High-class families would hire tutors for their children, and it is estimated that about 20% of the Roman population were literate. Beatings in Roman schools were extremely common and expected. A tutor who failed to beat his pupils was considered not to be doing his job. At the other end of life were the Roman ideas surrounding death, which varied by time and location. Most Romans were cremated after death, and their ashes were placed in a small niche in the wall of a tomb. These tombs could be small and serve a single family, or they could hold thousands of remains. The very poor were buried in mass unmarked graves and are entirely forgotten by history. Roman beliefs about the afterlife evolved over time and were influenced by various cultures and religions. However, there are certain commonalities that can be identified in their beliefs. In early Roman religion, the dead were believed to reside in the underworld, a shadowy and gloomy place ruled by the god Hades or Pluto. The underworld was divided into different sections, with the virtuous and heroic residing in the Elysian fields, and the wicked being punished in Tartarus. As Roman culture became more Hellenized, their beliefs about the afterlife became more influenced by Greek mythology. The idea of a judgment after death, with souls being sent to either punishment or reward, became more prominent. The god Mercury was also associated with guiding the souls of the dead to the afterlife. Another important aspect of Roman beliefs about the afterlife was the importance of ancestor worship. The spirits of ancestors were believed to be able to help or harm their living descendants, so it was important to honor and appease them through offerings and rituals. By the time of the Roman Empire, the concept of an individual soul that continued after death became more prominent. The philosopher Seneca, for example, believed in the immortality of the soul and the idea that the soul could continue to grow and learn even after death. Overall, Roman beliefs about the afterlife were varied and complex, with different ideas and practices evolving over time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments if you think you could survive in ancient Rome. Thank you for watching.